Good day and welcome back for another quick conversation between the Innovation for Equity, or IFE, team and incredible thought leaders in education. These conversations will range in topics and interests. Today, we will discuss reopening and recovery. More specifically, to what extent has the pandemic shaped our policies, practices, and beliefs about the inequities in school communities as we addressed unfinished learning. Founded less than 3 years ago by a group of Black leaders from across the education industry, IFE has grown to become a powerful network of nearly 2,000 professionals focused on leveraging innovation to improve the outcomes for Black children of all ages, from cradle to career. Today, I am joined by two of my favorite leaders, mentors, and friends, Doctors Mark Bedell, Superintendent of the Kansas City Public Schools, and Dr. Lisa Nicole Herring, Superintendent of Atlanta Public Schools. My name is Dr. Shaun Nelms, Associate Professor for the Center for Urban Education Success at the University of Rochester. As Superintendent, I also lead a transformation effort which aims to bridge theory and practice in urban schools. Our research has helped to improve one of the lowest performing schools in New York State. In 5 years, we have seen graduation rates climb from 29% to 78%. More importantly, we have more students leaving college, career, and civically prepared for life. Today will feel more like a conversation I have with Lisa and Mark on most evenings when I'm driving home, especially after a stressful day. They both have inspired leaders to change policy, practice, and beliefs across this nation, and I'm sure you will learn a ton from them. So Mark, let's start with you. Mark, you have been fighting the good fight in Kansas City. Briefly tell us about your school district and the work that you're doing to not only address the inequities in school, but also your community as you prepare to bring kids back.
Thank you, Shaun and Lisa. Nice to finally have an opportunity to meet you since we haven't been able to see each other at conferences. Shaun, look, man, I don't even know where to start. I think when you approached us about this conversation, I asked you, how real do you want me to be in this matter? And as we talk about equity, as we talk about systemic oppression, systemic racist practices, I've been here 5 years in the Kansas City Public School District. And one of the things I've shared with multiple people is that I'm more conscious of the fact that I'm a Black man living here than anywhere else I've ever lived. And as you know, both of us being from Rochester, New York, born and raised and high school graduates out of school systems in that area, I've seen a lot, right? And so living in Nashville, Tennessee, living in Houston, Texas, living in Baltimore, Maryland, I've never seen anything like what I've seen here. And it exists across all of our cities, but maybe it's more highlighted because of the position that I'm in and the exposure that I have to understanding how things are being done. And so we have a racially divided city. We have what is called the Troost divider line. And so east of Troost is primarily the kids that I serve. I have a 100% free and reduced lunch school district. We have about 15,000 students. We have probably another 12,000 that are in charter schools within our educational ecosystem. And so zip code has always predicted the outcomes in terms of whether this city would be open up for children or not. And so what I have come in and done did like a lot of other superintendents, made sure that we put an equity policy in place. Made sure that as we did our budgeting, we created an equitable funding budget model that really got a few people upset. It required our board to spend into their fund balance in order for us to give these schools who have children that show up with more needs a level playing field. But I've gone further than just the work that we've done internally, right? So when we talk about the trainings, helping everybody to understand how implicit biases play out, and now seeing that our student code of conduct has been completely written in a way that no longer allows for subjectivity to be inserted, then to being accused of, promoting anti-white rhetoric and bigotry because I'm requiring people to do equity training. I've seen it all. But what I've done now, Shaun, is I've taken it a step further because I've had to go after the development entity because of these economic development projects that tend to, abatements tend to take place on the back of the school districts that need the resources more. We rank number 17 in the country with the amount of abated money. $38 million in 2020 is what economic companies, developers were able to get. And none of the projects are taking place east of Troost. So when we talk about equity, right, there's a lot of inequitable practices that continue to plague our system that are all centered around structural racism. And if we don't call it out, then who will? And we are in these type of positions where we can leverage what we have and the access that we have to talk about how that impacts our communities in the aggregate. And so, Shaun, when you ask that question about, you know, how are we doing community level work? I mean, that's one of the areas that we're coming after pretty hard right now. And we can talk about that a little bit further. But I wanted to make sure I gave my peer an opportunity to speak here.
So man, the framing of that market is incredible. So I want to make sure that you know, we talk about policy, practices, and beliefs, that intersection between the three, which causes inequities to be truly addressed. You talked about having a code of conduct as a school superintendent be established. You talked about prioritizing your budget in ways that that focus your efforts, not just in the classroom, but the infrastructures that the kids are learning in, and the access to technology and such. And then you did this all after creating an equity policy. So you have policies, you have influenced practices, and that was solid about your beliefs. Your beliefs were so strong that you then went into the community and you started to address where the money was coming from and following the dollars and looking at development in your community to ensure that there's some intersection between the dollars that are going out of the school district as opposed to ignoring those things and leaving the kids without adequate resources. So the job of superintendent, if I could summarize, has expanded beyond beyond curriculum and instruction to now becoming a beacon of hope, a guardian of equity for kids outside of those school walls too. I'm gonna come back to you on that. Dr. Herring, Atlanta Public School Superintendent, you entered at the beginning of the pandemic. So I am praying for you. What have you learned, and how has that influenced what will happen as you reopen in Georgia, a state that has had some, to put it kindly, some start and stops right now with things politically, some start and stops around reopening of schools, and some very hard opinions about what the pandemic is and how it should be addressed. As superintendent, you sit in the middle of that. How are you doing, and how are you navigating those incredible political, social, and economic dynamics?
Yeah, so I appreciate the kind way of introducing a very unique past 11 months, Dr. Nelms. I actually think that this week is the 1-year anniversary of when Atlanta Public Schools announced that I was the sole finalist for superintendent for the school system. I'm pretty sure it was this week because it feels like it's been that kind of year. And then I wasn't sworn in until July, and yet it feels like the last 12 months would equate to maybe 12 years of work, just because it's been an unprecedented transition. And I am still standing. And so I appreciate that you asked, how am I? I'm well. And Mark, let me also just jump in and say it's a pleasure to meet you. We're all in this work together. And I don't think necessarily that what I'm doing is any less challenging than the work that we are all doing. It's just unique to the space in which we are living and breathing. So I'm here in the city of Atlanta, in my home state of Georgia, where I'm humbled and honored to take the helm of leadership as it relates to public education. APS has had a long-standing history of being a leader in trying to innovate, educate, and change the trajectory of children's lives. But I will say that this past year has been like no other. When I think about the first few months of my transitioning between Birmingham and Atlanta, as I would find myself in the makeshift office of our central location for district offices, there were protests happening outside of my office window. I had to leave the desk just to go and watch, and had to question whether I was going to watch go and participate. I was also worried because this is still in early spring when the pandemic still was evolving, and I'm looking at a diverse group of individuals who are mixed in race, mixed in age, and are angry and frustrated and demanding attention relative to social justice and issues of equity, and trying to, inside the brick and mortar of an office building, take into consideration what would be the first things I would have to lift upon this transition. It's been more than unique. I hate saying unprecedented, and I hate using the word unique because it's much more complex than that. But here's the truth, so Mark spoke briefly to, policy as well as practice as we've taken the helm. Whether you've been a sitting superintendent or not, this pandemic has put in front of us a spotlight that has forced us to look at things, if we weren't already doing so, that have completely brought to the forefront of our lens how we have either done our children well or how we have disserviced them. And that's been a reality in Atlanta Public Schools. I inherited a school system that, although it's had a history of its own share of challenges, whether it was the cheating scandal early on, and that my predecessor was hired to come in and help move the system out of that very challenging season. And I have inherited a season in which a board is focused on performance, they are focused on equity work, and they are focused on culture. And so I lift those three things, but I also say that you can't do any of those things without what Mark mentioned: the right policy, right, and assessment of practice. And then for me, at the core, what does performance look like for our children? What is performance? How have we taken that on? So in Georgia, much like across the country, we have not done a year of assessment with state assessment. So we don't really have strong indicators in the way that we're used to be able to put our hands on student performance. But we look at 2019 data, and I'm disheartened. I'm disheartened in a space where I see what performance looks like. About 77% of our APS students are low income in terms of our overall socioeconomic status. People think Atlanta, and they don't always think about that in terms of our reality. A good number of our children are living in poverty in the city of Atlanta, and those children are our Black and brown children, and that too is our truth. And when we look at achievement, academic achievement, 76% of our white students in APS are performing on grade level, compared to about 16% of our African-American students and 23% of our Hispanic students. That too is our truth, but it is a painful truth. It is a heavy burden to bear. And then we've also been discombobulated by this interruption of the learning process, right? And so what are we doing to address issues tied to disrupted learning, COVID learning loss, unfinished learning? We've given it so many titles, but I wrestle with how do we effectively bring our scholars, our children, back into our system and make certain that we don't lose them, because we've experienced a year of psychological warfare as it relates to the pandemic, mental health challenges, and discombobulated, disrupted instructional practices that we're all now trying to gather back together. That's a part of the reality. I am grateful that I have a board that had already put in place an equity policy. And Mark, you spoke a bit to policy. I think that's mission critical. But what they hired me to do as superintendent is to move from policy to practice to performance. And there lies the work, without trying to create a speech from that. That's where I find myself sitting now, Shaun and Mark, looking at what practices will we put in place based on our very robust policy that speaks to APS's embrace of equity work, and how we will do all things through the lens of equity. We've put in place a 5-year strategic plan that also unpacks that, but it's not what's on paper that moves me. It's what we do in the field, and that's where we currently sit.
So for those who are watching this, it is hard to have a conversation with two dynamic Black leaders about equity without us talking about the core. And it's hard to do that in a quick conversation. So I think we both are really touching on that, because we can have an entirely different conversation about being Black and thriving during this pandemic as leaders, as we see the world around us in chaos, socially around us in chaos, and trying to focus on the academic outcomes of our students. It's a tough thing to balance. But I want to get back to the idea around reopening and recovery of schools and recovery of learning and unfinished learning, whatever you want to call it. I want to get back to that, because we hope to all be reopened fully for every student for the 21-22 school year. We're working towards that. We're at different paces. Some people are 100% virtual. I know, Mark, you're moving back, hopefully in May or June to get kids back in. But let me just ask this question because we have about 10 minutes left.
Wow.
What do you want school to look like in that 21-22 school year around instruction, curriculum, mental health support, et cetera? And what will it take for that to occur within your district? And I'll go back to you, Dr. Bedell.
So for us, now it's important that we get all of our kids back in, but I also realize, learning from this pandemic, that we don't have to go back to doing things the way that we've done it in the past. I often talk about this chalkboard era of teaching and learning, and that we need to move away from that. And this pandemic has forced us to do it. Like, I think our educators are more ambidextrous now than any generation of educators out there, because they can now do the technology side of being able to deliver instruction, and they can also do the traditional model of being able to teach in front of students. And so as we look at our school district, we already started bringing our students back on a hybrid schedule. Tomorrow night at the board meeting, I will share with the community that is my intent that on May 3rd, we will be bringing back the vast majority of our students 100%. Outside of the schools where we're not able to accomplish the 3 feet of social distancing. So that means that my secondary schools may have to remain on a hybrid schedule due to class sizes and class enrollment. But ultimately, we will continue to have this virtual. We created what is called the Kansas City Virtual Academy. So we will have this virtual schooling be a part of our system moving forward, because I also learned that for some of our kids, they thrived in this model, and some of our kids are working and they're helping to make ends meet for their family. So to tell them that, no, you can't work now to help your family, and you're gonna have to go to a 7:20 to 2:20 schedule, I don't think that's fair. And I don't think that's being responsive to the needs of our community. So as a school district, we have to look at lessons learned from this national health pandemic and try to really reimagine. I know a lot of people talk about reimagining school, but we have an opportunity to do that, to be more responsive to the community at large. And so our district is going to be fully committed to that. The social and emotional needs of our kids are already, we had received a $3.2 million VOCA grant right before the pandemic hit. So we already have resources to address a lot of the social and emotional distress that our kids are showing up. And now having that CARES Act money really becomes a carrot, on top of everything, to continue to provide those supports. But we're going to do everything in our power. We're looking at evening school. I'm talking about night school options, because that's something we don't have in our district. We're looking at Saturday and Sunday opportunities for people who need to take advantage of that. We've already gotten a calendar approved to extend our school year, to extend the professional development, because we need that to also work with our teachers. And then really to focus on what are those priority standards that we truly need to go deep with to ensure that our kids are going to have a fair fighting chance upon graduation, given this pandemic and what it has done to us from a learning acceleration standpoint.
That's great. Yeah, that's a credible thing. Thanks, Mark. Dr. Herring.
Yep. So January 25th was when we opened the doors back to our community for parents to those who elected to come back into the face-to-face model were able to do so. So that was January 25th, during perhaps one of the most challenging times, because the community spread data was at its peak. But we had also followed the advisement and counsel of a health advisory task force that was inclusive of CDC leaders, infectious disease specialists, et cetera. I say that to say, here we are now in almost May, and only 40% of our community has maintained a commitment to being face-to-face. That's out of so we have 52,000 students, about 30,000 are representative of our traditional schools. The rest are charter and partner. And so within our traditional school population, on a day-to-day basis right now, we do have students that come face-to-face, but it's only 40% of the overall student population. So as we prepare for the summer and the fall and the next several years, we've implemented the following things. And so first, I should also say, we do surveillance testing here in APS. So every week, everyone who volunteers to do so, and we have um, a pretty strong cohort of us, parents, students, and staff who take a rapid COVID test if they're engaged in face-to-face learning. That's been a difference maker. I participate in that as well. So we have a sense of what that looks like in terms of being able to be proactive. Relative to an instructional model, we will do a different summer school approach. We are focusing very specifically on literacy and numeracy for our entire student population. So for us, summer school means about 1,800 teachers, close to 30,000 students who are eligible, particularly based on their performance indicators from the last state assessment that we did in 2019. Plus, we've looked at their performance throughout the course of this past school year. So they'll be invited to participate. But as we've launched our summer school efforts, it's not just for June of 2021. We will be doing this model for the next 3 years, in addition to an intervention block that's now going to be embedded in all of our grade levels, elementary, middle, and high school, which will focus either on literacy or numeracy. It's a non-negotiable around that intervention block, because we believe that what we need to do has to be stretched out over a period of time, but it also has to be intentionally modeled with an opportunity to check for fidelity. So that's also a part of our approach. We are also expanding our mental health and social emotional learning supports. We made that a part of our day-to-day curriculum in APS starting this past summer. We continue to do that, but we are also increasing the number of mental health, school social workers, school psychologists, and other student support service leaders to ensure that as much as possible, every school has direct access to the appropriate supports for mental health and also for wellness. But our key focus is around literacy and numeracy. And the other thing I'd say to that is, one of the things I was able to identify upon arrival was that we were absent of a universal screener that allowed for us to formulate some baseline analysis of how our students are performing in terms of being on grade level or not. And so we will implement that at the close of the summer as an opportunity to launch into appropriate interventions that will take us over the next 2+ years. So our approach is not for the summer and 21-22, but it starts June 21 and ends June 23.
And Lisa, can I say this, Shaun? I'm so sorry, but you just hit it on the head. You just remind me of my pattern, because when I came here in 2016, we had similar things around that universal screener.
Yeah.
Really, we had something, but it gave us norm reference data. It did not give us criterion reference data to really let us know how we're doing against, other folks around the state. And so we, after my first year, had to go in and make a similar change. So this is good to hear that. I just wanted to say that.
So it's reassuring, right? To just be able to, and I'll say this, Shaun and Mark, to just even in a 30-minute window, talk in this circle with our peers, so we put on our strongest leadership face. But, the burden is in what we do behind closed doors, because this is a heavy lift. I always say, if you genuinely love and care for children, and if you believe that part of your calling in this work is to fight the good fight on behalf of all, but also to be a warrior for those who have been underrepresented, it's a lot at the end of the day. But it is very reassuring when you say, hey, so Lisa, yes, that's good to hear, because we're thinking along the same lines. And that's also reassuring to me, Mark, as well. So I appreciate you saying that.
Well, I want to thank you both. I mean, if those listening can't understand why I call on you two weekly about a number of issues and topics related to education, then they missed the whole point. I mean, IFE is designed to bring incredibly powerful leaders together in safe spaces to have safe conversations about the work, and not to come to that space with all the answers, but really coming with an open mind and heart about how we are going to collectively address the unfinished learning that our kids are suffering, addressing how teachers and school leaders have to change their practice to be better reflective of the needs of our school and our school communities. And Mark, I want to thank you. I know we didn't get a chance to get into what you're doing with some of the business leaders in your community. I know, Lisa, you're doing some work as well. I just heard you on a webinar recently with some business leaders. The role of superintendent has moved from the schoolhouse to a position that reflects the entire community and leveraging the community to enhance the lives of our families. And so I know you both are doing that work. You are truly innovative. You are planned and purposeful. and the work that you're doing will change generations forever. So I thank you all for tuning in as we had this quick conversation around reopening, recovery, and unfinished learning. I'm Shaun Nelms, Lisa Herring, Mark Bedell saying thank you, and keep fighting a good fight.
Thank you all.
Oh, be well.
Take
Right.
care.